The winter wind slashed across the empty main street of Silver Creek like a knife, biting through Margaret Winters' clothing as she rode into town on a sickly mare, her late husband's oversized coat hanging from her thin shoulders, the collar pulled high against the biting cold of Colorado Territory, 1878. The journey from Kansas had taken nearly all her strength and resolve, the miles stretching endlessly behind her like the trail of grief she'd been trying to outrun for 6 months. 26 years old and already a widow, Margaret knew what the townsfolk would see. Another desperate woman with nothing but sadness in her eyes and a dead man's coat on her back. But she hadn't come all this way to be pitied. She guided her horse toward the only establishment showing signs of life, a saloon with windows glowing amber against the approaching dusk. The wooden sign hanging above the batwing doors read, "The Lucky Strike." Margaret took a deep breath, gathered what remained of her courage, and dismounted. Her boots hit the muddy ground with a soft thud. Every muscle in her body ached from days in the saddle. She tied her horse to the hitching post and paused to straighten her appearance as best she could, tucking loose strands of chestnut hair beneath her hat and adjusting Thomas's coat around her slight frame. The sleeves hung past her fingertips, and she rolled them back for the 3rd time that day. "You look like you've ridden through hell," came a deep voice from behind her. Margaret spun around, her hand instinctively moving to the small revolver hidden in her coat pocket. A tall man stood watching her, his face partially shadowed by a worn Stetson. His posture was relaxed, one shoulder leaning against the saloon's outer post, but his eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. "I've come from Kansas." "Close enough," she replied, voice steady despite her exhaustion. The man stepped forward into the light spilling from the saloon windows. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a short beard covering his jaw. He was older than her by perhaps a decade, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "Name's Henry Reid," he said. "I own the livery stable down the street." "Your mare could use some care." Margaret assessed him carefully before responding. "Margaret Winters, and yes, she could." "Winters?" Henry's expression shifted slightly. "Any relation to Thomas Winters?" The sound of her husband's name on a stranger's lips sent a shock through Margaret's body. "He was my husband." Henry's eyes dropped to the oversized coat she wore, recognition dawning in his gaze. "I knew Thomas. Good man. Heard he passed last summer. Influenza, wasn't it?" Margaret nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Winters," Henry said, his voice softening. "Thomas talked about you whenever he passed through, said he had the prettiest wife waiting for him back in Kansas." "He's not waiting anymore," Margaret said, more sharply than she'd intended. "And neither am I. I need work, Mr. Reid." "That's why I've come to Silver Creek." Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her exhausted state, the determination in her stance despite it all. "You got family here?" "No, just Thomas's stories about this place. He always said if anything happened to him, Silver Creek would be a good town to start over." She lifted her chin. "I can cook, clean, sew, and keep books. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I don't doubt that," Henry said. "Riding all the way from Kansas alone proves as much." He gestured toward the saloon. "Miss Clara owns the boarding house next door. She might have a room available. As for work," he paused, considering. "The general store could use help with their books. Owner's eyesight isn't what it used to be." Margaret felt a small flicker of hope, the first she'd experienced in months. "Thank you, Mr. Reid." "Henry," he corrected. "And I'll take your mare to the stable, give her some feed and a good rub-down, no charge for tonight." "I can pay," Margaret insisted. "I've no doubt," Henry said, a hint of a smile finally touching his lips. "But Thomas once helped me when I was in a tight spot. Consider it repayment of an old debt." Before Margaret could argue further, Henry gently took the reins from her hand. "Go get some rest, Mrs. Winters. Things'll look better in the morning." Margaret watched as he led her exhausted mare down the street, his tall figure moving with the easy grace of a man accustomed to handling horses. Something about his kindness, offered without pity, nearly broke the careful composure she'd maintained during her journey. She turned toward the boarding house, Thomas's coat heavy on her shoulders. The weight of it was both burden and comfort, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she still had to find. Miss Clara turned out to be a widow herself, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that had seen enough of life's hardships to recognize a kindred spirit. She provided Margaret with a small but clean room, a hot bath, and a hearty meal that Margaret could barely finish before exhaustion claimed her. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, Margaret stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a town she didn't know yet. Thomas's coat hung on a hook by the door, its familiar silhouette a ghost in the darkness. "I'm here," she whispered to the empty room. "Now what?" sleep claimed her before an answer came. Morning arrived with pale sunlight and the sounds of a town coming to life. Margaret dressed in her cleanest remaining clothes, a simple blue dress worn thin at the elbows and pinned her hair in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Thomas's wedding ring hung on a chain around her neck, tucked safely beneath her collar. Her own ring remained on her finger, a small gold band that had grown loose as grief had stripped pounds from her frame. Miss Clara directed her to Hartman's general store, where Mr. Hartman, a balding man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, hired her on the spot after learning she could manage ledgers and had neat handwriting. The pay was modest, but it included a meal at midday and Sundays off. It was more than Margaret had dared hope for on her first day in town. By noon, she'd organized the chaotic stack of invoices that had accumulated over the winter months and corrected 3 significant accounting errors in Mr. Hartman's favor. The elderly shopkeeper was so pleased, he insisted she take a small bag of peppermint candies as a bonus. Margaret was carefully copying figures into the main ledger when the shop bell jingled. She looked up to see Henry Reid entering, hat in hand. He'd shaved, she noticed, and wore a clean shirt beneath his leather vest. "Mrs. Winters," he greeted her with a nod. "I see you found work already, Mr. Reid was just telling me how you helped save his business this morning," Mr. Hartman called from where he was stocking shelves. "Sharp as a tack, this one." "I'm not surprised," Henry said, his eyes meeting Margaret's. "Your mare's looking better after a night's rest and some good feed. Thought you might want to come see her when you're finished here." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I'll stop by the livery after work." Henry nodded and turned to Mr. Hartman. "Need a few things, Joseph. Some coffee, if you've got it, and tobacco." As Mr. Hartman helped Henry with his purchases, Margaret returned her attention to the ledger, but found her concentration disrupted. There was something unsettling about Henry Reid, not in a threatening way, but in how he looked at her. Not with pity or the calculation she'd grown used to from men who saw only a vulnerable widow, but with a kind of recognition, as though he understood something about her that she hadn't yet voiced. Later that afternoon, Margaret made her way to the livery stable. The large wooden structure smelled of hay, leather, and horses' familiar scents that reminded her of the small farm she and Thomas had struggled to maintain in Kansas. Henry was in one of the stalls, brushing down a large bay gelding when she entered. "Mrs. Winters," he acknowledged, setting aside the brush. "Your mare's over here." He led her to a stall where her horse stood looking remarkably improved after just one day of proper care. The animal's coat had been thoroughly brushed, and she nickered softly at Margaret's approach. "She just needed some rest and good feed," Henry said. "Another day or two and she'll be right as rain." "Thank you," Margaret said, stroking the mare's nose. "She was Thomas's horse. I wasn't sure she'd make the journey." "Thomas had a good eye for horseflesh," Henry commented. "This one's got heart." Margaret glanced at him. "How did you know my husband?" Henry leaned against the stall door. "He passed through Silver Creek a few times a year. Always had some scheme or other, a mining claim, a cattle drive, once even a wild story about a lost Spanish treasure." A fond smile softened his features. "Never amounted to much, but Thomas wasn't the type to give up." "No," Margaret agreed quietly, "he wasn't." Until the fever had taken him, Thomas had fought for every breath, promising her even at the end that things would get better, that his next venture would be the one to provide the security they'd never managed to find. "He spoke of you often," Henry continued. "Said you were the one steady thing in his life." Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. "We were married 7 years. I spent most of them waiting for him to return from his latest venture, for our luck to change." She stroked the mare's neck, avoiding Henry's gaze. In the end, I waited too long. For what? To tell him I was tired of waiting. The admission felt like a betrayal, but the words had been bottled inside her for too long. I should have insisted we build something real, something lasting, instead of chasing dreams across half the territory. Henry was quiet for a moment. Thomas wasn't built for putting down roots. No, Margaret agreed, but I am. She squared her shoulders. That's why I'm here, to plant myself somewhere and grow something that can't be packed up and moved at the first rumor of opportunity elsewhere. Henry studied her with those observant eyes. Silver Creek's a good place for roots, soil's fertile, so to speak, so I'm hoping to discover. Margaret stepped back from the stall. What do I owe you for caring for my horse? Nothing today, Henry said. But if you're determined to pay your own way, I could use some help with my books. I'm better with horses than figures. Margaret considered the offer. 2 hours on Sunday after church, at a fair rate. Henry's mouth twitched with amusement. Sounds like I'm getting the better end of that bargain, Mrs. Winters. Perhaps, Margaret allowed a small smile, or perhaps I'm simply establishing my value in this town from the start. A wise approach, Henry acknowledged with a respectful nod. Sunday after church, then. As Margaret turned to leave, Henry called after her. That coat, Thomas's coat, it suited him, but it doesn't suit you. Margaret paused, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the worn lapel of the oversized garment she donned again for her walk to the livery. It's warm, she said simply. So are many coats that might actually fit, Henry pointed out. Mrs. Peterson at the dress shop could help you find something more suitable. Margaret felt a flash of defensiveness. I don't need fashion advice, Mr. Reid. Not fashion, practicality. His voice remained even. A coat that fits does a better job of keeping out the cold. And, he added more gently, it's hard to start a new chapter when you're still wearing the cover of the old one. The words struck Margaret with unexpected force. She'd been wearing Thomas's coat since the day after his funeral, partly for practical reasons, as she'd sold most of her own things to pay for medicine during his illness, but also as a way of keeping him close, of hiding within the last tangible piece of their life together. Good day, Mr. Reid, she said stiffly, and left before he could see how deeply his observation had affected her. That Sunday, after attending the small white church at the edge of town, Margaret made her way to the livery stable as agreed. She wore her blue dress, freshly washed and pressed, and had used some of her first wages to purchase a simple wool shawl rather than wearing Thomas's coat. Henry noticed the change immediately, his eyes taking in her appearance with quiet approval as he led her to a small office at the back of the stable. The space was surprisingly tidy, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove providing warmth against the early spring chill. Not what you expected, he asked, seeing her surprise. I assumed we'd be working in the stable proper, Margaret admitted. I may spend most of my time with horses, Mrs. Winters, but I do possess some civilized habits, Henry said with a trace of humor. He gestured to the chair behind the desk. Please make yourself comfortable. For the next 2 hours, Margaret organized Henry's business records, creating a system that would be easy for him to maintain. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, but his bookkeeping methods were haphazard at best. Despite this, it was clear the livery was prosperous. You've done well for yourself, Margaret observed as she reviewed the previous year's figures. Silver Creek's growing, Henry said from where he sat across the desk. The railroad spur that came through last year has brought new business. People need horses, wagons need repair. How long have you been here? Margaret asked, curious about this man who had known her husband. Going on 15 years now, Henry replied. Came out from Pennsylvania after the war with not much more than the clothes on my back and a talent for handling horses. The war, Margaret looked up, reassessing his age. I was young, lied about my age to enlist. A shadow crossed his face. Saw things no 16-year-old should see. Couldn't stay in the East afterward. Margaret nodded, understanding. Many men had fled westward after the war, seeking to escape memories or reinvent themselves. And now you own the largest livery stable between Denver and Santa Fe, according to Mr. Hartman. Henry smiled, the expression warming his face. Joseph exaggerates, but I've done all right. He paused. "What about you, Mrs. Winters? What were you before you were a wife?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Few people had ever asked about her life before Thomas. "I was a schoolteacher." "For a brief time?" "Why brief?" "I met Thomas. He was passing through the town where I taught, full of stories about places I'd only read about in books." She smiled at the memory. "I was 19 and had never been more than 20 miles from home. He promised to show me the world." "And did he?" "Parts of it. We moved often, following his dreams." Margaret's fingers absently traced the edge of the ledger. "But I never saw the ocean. He always promised we'd go someday when his fortunes changed." "The Pacific's not so far from here," Henry remarked. "Few hundred miles west." "A journey for another life, perhaps," Margaret said, closing the ledger. "I've had my fill of chasing horizons, Mr. Reid. I came to Silver Creek to stop moving." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough, but standing still and putting down roots aren't quite the same thing." "Meaning?" "Roots grow, reach out. They don't just anchor, they seek nourishment." His eyes held hers. "What will nourish you here, Mrs. Winters?" The question lingered between them, unexpectedly intimate. Margaret found herself without a ready answer. What would nourish her? She'd been so focused on survival, on finding a place to exist after Thomas, that she hadn't considered what might help her thrive. "I don't know yet," she admitted finally, "but I intend to find out." Henry smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "That's a fine start." Spring progressed into summer, and Margaret settled into life in Silver Creek with a gradually increasing sense of belonging. Her work at the general store expanded to include helping customers and ordering stock, as Mr. Hartman came to rely on her organizational skills and good judgment. Sunday afternoons at Henry's livery became a regular commitment, their professional relationship evolving into a cautious friendship. Margaret learned that Henry was respected throughout the town not only for his business acumen, but for his fairness and willingness to help neighbors in need. He served on the town council, contributed generously to the small school, and was known to extend credit to those going through hard times. She also discovered he had a dry wit that often caught her by surprise, making her laugh when she least expected it. These moments of unexpected joy were precious to Margaret, who had almost forgotten what it felt like to experience happiness without the sharp edge of guilt that had accompanied any positive feeling since Thomas's death. One warm July evening, Henry invited Margaret to join him for supper at the hotel restaurant, the finest establishment in Silver Creek, though that wasn't saying much. Margaret accepted, telling herself it was merely a friendly gesture, even as she spent extra time arranging her hair and wore her newest dress, a sage green cotton purchased with her own earnings. Henry was waiting for her on the hotel porch, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a clean black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He stood when he saw her approach, his expression shifting to one of quiet appreciation. "Mrs. Winters," he greeted her, "you look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Reid," she replied, feeling a flutter of nervousness she hadn't experienced in years. "You clean up rather well yourself." The meal was simple but well-prepared: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh vegetables from local gardens. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on town gossip, books they'd both read, and memories of places they'd been. Margaret found herself sharing stories about her childhood in Ohio that she hadn't recalled in years, drawn out by Henry's genuine interest. "You know," Henry said as they finished their meal, "in all these months I've never once heard you call me by my given name." Margaret took a sip of water to hide her smile. "I wasn't aware we'd progressed to such familiarity, Mr. Reid. Haven't we?" His eyes held hers across the table. "I'd say a woman who knows every detail of my business accounts has earned the right to use my Christian name." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded, "but propriety is important," Henry finished for her. "I understand that, but so is honesty between friends." He leaned forward slightly. "And we are friends, aren't we, Margaret?" The sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Yes," she admitted, "we are, Henry." His smile at her use of his name was worth the small breach of formality. As they walked back toward the boarding house after dinner, Margaret realized with a start that she hadn't thought of Thomas once during the entire evening. The realization brought a confusing mixture of guilt and relief. "You're quiet," Henry observed as they approached Miss Clara's establishment. Just thinking, Margaret replied. She paused at the gate. Thank you for dinner, it was lovely. My pleasure. Henry hesitated, then asked, would you consider joining me for a ride on Sunday afternoon, after church and our usual business, of course? There's a spot by the creek a few miles out of town that's quite beautiful this time of year. Margaret knew she should refuse. A private outing with a single man, no matter how respected in the community, would certainly cause talk. Yet she found herself nodding. I'd like that. Henry's expression brightened. Good, that's good. He took a step back. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Henry. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she caught sight of Thomas's coat, still hanging on the hook where she'd placed it months ago. She hadn't worn it since that day at the livery when Henry had made his observation about new chapters. Moving closer, she ran her fingers over the worn fabric, remembering how Thomas had looked in it, always in motion, always looking toward the next opportunity just beyond reach. For the first time, she could think of him without that crushing weight of grief. The memories were still tinged with sadness, but also with fondness and a growing understanding that loving Thomas with all his restlessness and dreams had been part of her journey, not the destination. I miss you, she whispered to the empty coat, but I'm still here, still living. The Sunday ride with Henry became another, and then another, each outing allowing Margaret to see more of the beautiful country surrounding Silver Creek and more of the man himself. He showed her hidden valleys where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion, taught her to identify the tracks of different animals, and once, memorably, helped her ford a stream when summer rains had swollen it beyond its usual gentle flow. By August, Margaret had moved from Miss Clara's boarding house to a small cottage on the edge of town. The building belonged to Mr. Hartman, who offered it to Margaret at a reasonable rent in exchange for her taking on more responsibilities at the store. The cottage had 2 rooms, a vegetable garden, and a sense of permanence that satisfied something deep in Margaret's soul. Henry helped her move her few possessions and spent several evenings repairing the cottage's sagging porch and leaky roof. Margaret cooked for him as payment, discovering that preparing meals for someone who expressed genuine appreciation for her efforts brought an unexpected joy. On a warm evening in late August, they sat on the newly repaired porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. A comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind that comes only with true companionship. I received a letter today, Margaret said finally, from Thomas's brother in San Francisco. Henry turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. Oh, he's finally settled Thomas's affairs there. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. There was a small mining claim that apparently held more value than Thomas realized. His brother sold it. And now I find myself with a modest inheritance. Margaret shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. All those schemes and the one that finally succeeded came too late for him to know it. Henry was quiet for a moment. What will you do with it? That's what I've been considering. Margaret looked out at the deepening twilight. I could go anywhere now. Start fresh with enough money to establish myself properly. She felt rather than saw Henry tense beside her. Is that what you want, to leave Silver Creek? Margaret turned to face him fully. No, I've found something here I never expected to find again. What's that? Henry's voice was carefully controlled, but his eyes revealed a vulnerability that made Margaret's heart beat faster. A home, she said softly. Not just a place to live, but a true home, with people I care for, work that satisfies me. She took a deep breath. A future I can see clearly, not just dream about. Henry's expression softened. I'm glad to hear it. Silver Creek would be poorer without you. Just Silver Creek? Margaret asked, emboldened by the growing darkness and the emotions she could no longer ignore. Henry reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin. No, he said quietly, not just Silver Creek. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands joined, until Henry spoke again. When Thomas came through town the last time, about a year before he died, he showed me your daguerreotype. Told me you were the best thing that ever happened to him, even if he didn't always show it. Henry's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. I remember thinking he was a lucky man and wondering if he truly knew how lucky. Our marriage wasn't perfect, Margaret admitted. Thomas was always chasing tomorrow, and I was always trying to build today. And now I understand that both have their place. She squeezed his hand. We need roots and wings, don't we? Henry smiled, the expression visible even in the fading light. We do, though I'll admit at my age I'm more interested in the roots. Are you calling yourself old, Henry Reid? Margaret teased. Experienced, he corrected with a chuckle. Old enough to recognize something precious when I find it. His expression grew serious. Margaret, I don't want to rush you. I know you're still healing, still finding your way, but I want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. The simple declaration, offered without pressure or expectation, touched Margaret deeply. Thank you, she whispered, for understanding that I need time. Time is something I have plenty of, Henry assured her, especially now that my books are in such good order. His gentle humor broke the tension, and Margaret laughed. The sound drifted into the evening air, free and unencumbered by grief for the first time in longer than she could remember. Fall brought cooler temperatures and changing leaves, painting the landscape around Silver Creek in vibrant oranges and yellows. Margaret used part of her inheritance to purchase the cottage from Mr. Hartman, making it truly hers. She planted bulbs in the small front garden, an act of faith in a future spring she now looked forward to witnessing. Her friendship with Henry deepened with each passing week. They attended church together on Sundays, rode out to explore the countryside when weather permitted, and shared simple meals at her cottage or occasionally at the hotel restaurant. The town observed their growing closeness with approving nods and knowing smiles, accepting what the two of them were only beginning to acknowledge to each other. On a crisp October afternoon, Margaret was organizing a new shipment of winter goods at the general store when Mr. Hartman approached her with an envelope. Special delivery for you, he said, handing her the telegram. Ryder brought it from the station just now. Margaret opened it with a slight frown, wondering who would send her a telegram. The message was brief. Arriving Silver Creek tomorrow noon. Stop Thomas Winters. Jr. Stop. The paper trembled in her hand. Thomas Jr., her husband's son from a brief first marriage that had ended when the boy's mother died in childbirth. The child had been raised by his maternal grandparents in St. Louis, with Thomas sending money when he could but rarely seeing the boy. He would be 16 now, almost a man. Bad news? Mr. Hartman asked, noting her expression. No, Margaret said, finding her voice. Not bad, just unexpected. My stepson is arriving tomorrow. I didn't know you had family coming. Neither did I. Margaret carefully folded the telegram. Mr. Hartman, would it be possible for me to have tomorrow afternoon free? I should prepare for his arrival. Of course, my dear, the elderly shopkeeper assured her. Family comes first. Margaret left the store early, her mind racing with questions. Why was Thomas Jr. coming now? How had he found her? What did he want? In their 7 years of marriage, she had met the boy only twice, during brief visits that had been awkward for everyone involved. Thomas had been uncomfortable in his role as a father to a child he barely knew, and Margaret had been uncertain of her place as a stepmother with no real authority or connection. Her first stop was Henry's livery stable. She found him shoeing a horse, his strong hands working with practiced efficiency. He looked up at her approach, his smile fading as he noted her expression. What's wrong? He asked, immediately setting aside his tools. Margaret handed him the telegram. Henry read it quickly, his brow furrowing. Thomas had a son from his first marriage. The boy lives lived with his grandparents in St. Louis. Margaret twisted her hands together. I don't know why he's coming here. Henry handed the telegram back to her. Only one way to find out. Would you like me to be there when he arrives? The offer touched her deeply. Would you? I hardly know him, and yet he's the closest thing to family I have left, of course. Henry reached out and gently stilled her nervous hands with one of his. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this, Margaret. His quiet assurance calmed her racing thoughts. Thank you, she said, meaning it more than she could express. The following day, Margaret waited at the stagecoach stop with Henry beside her, his solid presence a comfort as the noon coach rolled into town in a cloud of dust. Her heart pounded as passengers began to disembark: a businessman, a woman with a small child, an elderly couple, and finally, a tall young man with a single valise. Margaret recognized him immediately, though he had grown considerably since she'd last seen him. Thomas Jr. had his father's lanky build and the same way of holding his shoulders, but his features were finer, presumably inherited from his mother. He scanned the waiting crowd until his gaze landed on Margaret. After a moment's hesitation, he approached Mrs. Winters. He asked, his voice caught between boyhood and manhood. "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "It's good to see you, Thomas," she gestured to Henry. "This is my friend, Mr. Henry Reid." The young man nodded politely to Henry before turning back to Margaret. "I apologize for the short notice. I wasn't sure how else to reach you." "It's fine," Margaret assured him. "I've prepared a room for you at my cottage. We can talk there." The walk to the cottage was filled with awkward small-talk comments about his journey, the weather, how Silver Creek compared to St. Louis. Henry excused himself when they reached Margaret's home, promising to return later to check on them, giving Margaret a reassuring smile that strengthened her resolve. Inside the cottage, Margaret prepared tea while Thomas Jr. sat stiffly at her small kitchen table. When she finally sat across from him, the young man reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "My grandparents died last month. Influenza." His voice was steady, but Margaret could see the grief in his eyes. "While settling their affairs, I found this letter from my father. It was written to me, but they never gave it to me." He slid the envelope across the table. "It was written a week before he died. I think you should read it." With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the envelope. The familiar handwriting brought an immediate lump to her throat. "My dear son, if you are reading this, I have failed in my intention to deliver these words to you in person. I have been ill, and while Margaret assures me I am improving, I find myself needing to put certain truths on paper in case my recovery is not as complete as we hope. I have been a poor excuse for a father to you. This failure ranks among my greatest regrets. I told myself that leaving you with your mother's parents was best for you, that my wandering ways would provide no stable home for a child. This was true, but it was also convenient, allowing me to pursue my own path unburdened. As I face the possibility of my own mortality, I am thinking of legacy, what I will leave behind. In material terms, it is sadly little, but I have been blessed with two treasures far more valuable than gold: you, my son, and Margaret, my wife. Margaret is everything I am not: steady, practical, loyal to a fault. She has followed me across half the territory, building homes I was too restless to appreciate. If I do not recover, she will likely return to her family in Ohio, but I wish instead that she would go to Silver Creek in Colorado Territory. It is a good town with good people. I have friends there who would help her establish herself. And I wish, my son, that when you are old enough you would seek her out, not for my sake, but for your own. Margaret has a capacity for love that I never deserved but always treasured. You both deserve family, and perhaps you might find in each other what I failed to provide to either of you. With deepest regret for my failings and greatest love for you both, your father, Thomas Winters." Margaret set the letter down, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I never knew he wrote to you," she said softly. "He was delirious with fever near the end. I didn't know he had moments of such clarity." "I didn't come looking for charity," Thomas Jr. said quickly. "I have some money saved from working at my grandfather's print shop, but I thought—" He hesitated, suddenly looking very young. "I thought perhaps we could at least know each other." "As my father wished." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "I would like that very much, Thomas. Everyone calls me TJ, he offered with a small smile. "TJ, then?" Margaret returned his smile through her tears. "Your father was right about Silver Creek. It is a good town with good people. I've found a home here, and there's room in that home for you if you want it." The young man's eyes brightened with hope. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Not at all," Margaret assured him, surprised to discover how deeply she meant it. "In fact, I think it might be exactly what we both need." TJ stayed. What began as a visit extended into weeks, then months. He found work at the town newspaper, his experience in his grandfather's print shop proving valuable. Margaret's cottage, which had seemed perfectly sized for one, adapted naturally to accommodate two, and then increasingly a third, as Henry became a regular presence in their evolving family circle. By Christmas, Margaret had to admit to herself what everyone in Silver Creek already seemed to know. She was in love with Henry Reid. The realization didn't come as a lightning bolt, but as a gradual dawning, like the slow brightening of the eastern sky before sunrise. She loved his steady strength, his quiet humor, his capacity for kindness without condescension. Most of all, she loved how he made her feel not rescued or pitied, but truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. On Christmas Eve, after TJ had gone to bed, Henry and Margaret sat before the fire in her small parlor. A modest Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper ornaments and candles, presents wrapped in brown paper nestled beneath its boughs. "I have something for you," Henry said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until tomorrow, but—" He withdrew a small package and handed it to her. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to find a small velvet box. Inside was a gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," Henry explained softly. "Margaret, I've grown to love you more than I ever thought possible at my age. You've brought light back into my life." He took her hand. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I know it might be too soon, and with TJ now in your life, things are complicated. But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, I'm hoping you'll consider becoming my wife." Margaret looked at the ring, then at the man offering it to her, this good, steady man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and never once made her feel weak for it. In his eyes, she saw not the wild promises Thomas had offered, but something far more precious, a love rooted in reality, in genuine understanding and acceptance. "Henry," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling in her chest, "I don't need time to consider. My answer is yes." Joy transformed his features. "Yes, yes," Margaret confirmed, tears of happiness spilling onto her cheeks. "I love you, Henry Reid. I can't think of anything I want more than to build a life with you." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as though made for her. Then he drew her into his arms and kissed her a gentle kiss that held all the promise of the future they would share. Later, as Henry was preparing to leave, Margaret went to the hook by the door where Thomas's coat still hung. She took it down carefully, running her hands over the worn fabric one last time before holding it out to him. "Would you take this to TJ's room?" she asked. "I think he should have it, a piece of his father to keep." Henry accepted the coat with understanding in his eyes. Of course. As he carried it away, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness. Thomas would always be part of her story, the chapter that had brought her to Silver Creek, to Henry, to this unexpected family she was building. But Henry had been right that first day. It wasn't her last chapter. Far from it. Her new chapter was just beginning, and she couldn't wait to see what the next page would bring.